Margaret Thompson, a woman of humble appearance, entered the lavish hotel in New York with silent steps, contrasting with the opulence around her. The simple clothes she wore seemed out of place in the luxurious environment, drawing disapproving glances and malicious whispers among the staff. Without taking her eyes off the floor, Margaret approached the reception desk, clutching her small, worn leather bag tightly. What should have been a simple reservation check quickly turned into a scene of public embarrassment when the young receptionist, with a disdainful smile, threw the first stone in a series of humiliations. But at that moment, while Margaret stood her ground, no one could imagine the weight of the truth she carried with her. By the time they realized the mistake, it was too late. The weight of silence. Margaret Thompson walked through the revolving doors of the hotel with light but firm steps. Her serene and distant gaze wandered over the crystal chandeliers and the velvet carpets that covered the floor. The contrast between her figure and the environment could not have been more evident. Her clothes were modest, the fabric of her faded dress worn by time, and her shoes, though polished, showed signs of a long journey. To the trained eyes of the hotel staff, she was an intruder in a world that did not belong to her. "Can I help you?" The receptionist, a young blonde with a forced smile, lifted her eyes just enough to see the figure in front of her. "I have a reservation," Margaret replied, her voice calm yet firm. She opened her small bag and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. The receptionist's gaze lingered on the paper for a moment, then quickly returned to the computer, where her fingers typed with rehearsed precision. The seconds stretched as Margaret waited in silence. The receptionist, however, seemed to be taking longer than necessary. Quick glances were exchanged among the staff. Whispers escaped from the corners. "I'm sorry," said the receptionist, raising her eyes again, this time with a glimmer of superiority. "But it seems there was a mistake. This hotel is very exclusive. Perhaps you're looking for another place." Margaret frowned slightly but maintained her composure. "I'm sure of my reservation. Could you please check again?" "I checked, and I can assure you that we do not have a reservation for—" She glanced at the paper again. "Margaret Thompson." A murmur began to grow behind the counter, and the manager, a middle-aged woman with an air of authority, approached. She whispered something in the receptionist's ear, who immediately adopted an even more evident expression of disdain. "I need you to leave the hotel, ma'am," the manager said, her voice low but authoritative. "We do not allow fraud here." Margaret did not back down. Her eyes locked onto the manager's, but she remained silent. For a moment it seemed time had stopped, and the opulent hotel lobby had become the stage for a silent tension. It was then that Margaret, still without uttering a word, took her piece of paper and put it back in her bag. She turned slowly, ready to leave. Two security guards, who had been discreetly called, approached, blocking her exit. "We'll escort you to the door," they said in a professional tone. As they led her out, Margaret stood tall, her gaze fixed straight ahead, as if the humiliation did not affect her. But at that same moment, a young journalist in the lobby, Brian Carter, was watching everything with growing attention. Something in Margaret's posture, in the serenity with which she faced the situation, ignited his curiosity. He followed her steps with his eyes as she walked out the door, feeling that there was much more to this woman than met the eye. Margaret Thompson, upon being expelled, turned right, disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians on the sidewalk. Brian couldn't take his eyes off the scene, and a question echoed in his mind. Who was that woman? And why, despite everything, did she not say a word in her defense? The details he had witnessed that morning disturbed him. The unanswered questions seemed to scream for an investigation. Brian Carter, known for his keen instinct for good stories, decided he could not simply let this pass. He closed his notebook, put away his camera, and hurried out after the mysterious woman, not even knowing why. But something told him that by following Margaret, he was about to uncover a story much bigger than he imagined. Brian followed Margaret from a safe distance through the streets of New York. With each step she took, the feeling grew stronger that he was about to discover something significant. She walked leisurely, as if time did not matter, blending into the crowd that completely ignored her. Finally, she stopped in front of an old building, one of those that had seen better days, and walked in. Brian hesitated for a moment before deciding to follow her inside. The building had the smell of old wood and an air of abandonment, but Margaret seemed at ease, as if she were at home. He waited outside the apartment where she had entered, listening to the sound of doors closing. He stood there, trying to process everything. Margaret Thompson. Who was she? And why would a woman with a reservation at a luxury hotel choose to live in a place like this? Brian decided he needed to know more. He began asking questions in nearby shops, cafes, trying to uncover something about the mysterious lady. What he discovered surprised him. Margaret Thompson was a name everyone seemed to know, but no one could say exactly from where. There were vague stories, rumors, but nothing concrete. Determined, Brian spent the night researching. It was then that he found something that would change everything. An old black-and-white photo of an elegant woman at a charity event. The caption was clear. Margaret Thompson, one of the country's greatest philanthropists, known for her anonymous donations and unprecedented generosity. But the photo was from decades ago. Brian couldn't believe that the humble woman he saw being expelled from the hotel could be the same as the one in the photo. But the coincidences were too many. The name, the face, and the mystery surrounding her disappearance. Margaret had simply vanished from the spotlight years ago, leaving no trace. Now, he knew he was dealing with something much bigger. The woman who had been humiliated at the hotel was not just any old lady. She was a powerful figure, a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others, but for some reason, she had chosen to live in anonymity. But why? What had happened to Margaret for her to abandon everything? And why, even in the face of such humiliation, had she not reacted? Brian knew he was just beginning to unravel the story. But one thing was certain. He needed to find Margaret again and discover the whole truth. Brian spent the next few days trying to track down Margaret. The image of that woman, so strong and dignified in her simplicity, lingered in his mind. Each time he replayed the scene at the hotel, he felt a mix of anger and indignation at how she had been treated. But at the same time, there was a growing admiration for how Margaret had faced everything without giving in to rage or despair. It was as if she knew something that others ignored, something that kept her above that situation. Brian's search led him to libraries, archives, and conversations with people who vaguely remembered Margaret from her days of philanthropy. There were old photos, forgotten articles in newspapers yellowed by time. Everything indicated that she had been a woman of great influence, but for some reason, she had chosen to disappear from public life. There was much to be discovered, but one thing was already clear. Margaret Thompson was not an ordinary person. On a rainy morning, after a long night of research, Brian got a crucial lead. An old journalism colleague gave him a contact that promised to have valuable information. It was a middle-aged man with a hoarse voice, cautious on the phone. "You want to know about Margaret Thompson? She's a legend among us, but not in the way you think. It's not just for her donations or her life as a philanthropist. It's for what she lost, and what she did after that." Brian felt a chill. What did she lose? There was an accident years ago. Tragic. She lost her husband and son all at once. That's when everything changed. She withdrew from the world, gave away all her wealth, and no one heard from her again. Until now, it seems. Brian listened to the words with a lump in his throat. The pain that Margaret carried, the choice to retreat to a simple life, and the way she faced humiliation with dignity all made sense now. He knew he had to go further. He had to talk to Margaret and understand how she had transformed her pain into something so profound that she preferred to live in the shadows, away from the recognition she once received. Determined to secure the interview, Brian began frequenting the neighborhood where Margaret had last been seen. Finally, on a sunny afternoon, he spotted her leaving a corner store, carrying a brown paper bag. He hesitated for a moment, but he knew he wouldn't get another chance. He approached her carefully. "Miss Margaret?" She turned slowly, her blue eyes meeting his with a calmness that seemed to penetrate his soul. "Yes?" "My name is Brian Carter. I'm a journalist and I was at the hotel that day. I saw what happened, and since then I haven't been able to get it out of my mind. I researched about you and... Please, I need to understand." She fell silent for a moment, examining him with a thoughtful gaze. There was no hostility, just a stillness that revealed the depth of someone who had seen and suffered much more than anyone could imagine. "Understand what exactly, Mr. Carter? Why? Why leave everything behind? Why live like this when you could have anything you want?" Margaret sighed, looking up at the sky for a moment, as if searching for the words among the clouds. "Because once you lose what matters most, the rest doesn't make sense anymore. Luxury, recognition, none of that brings back the people we love. And then, we discover that true wealth lies in something much simpler." Brian felt a tightness in his chest. The serenity with which Margaret spoke contrasted sharply with the intensity of the pain her words revealed. "But you still do so much, help so many people. Why keep it a secret?" "Because it's not about me. It never was. It's about those who need it. When the focus is on the one helping, the true purpose gets lost. I prefer that my actions speak for themselves." In that moment, Brian knew he was in the presence of an extraordinary woman. Margaret wasn't seeking redemption for herself, nor recognition. She had found a way to transform her pain into a silent force that touched lives without ever asking for anything in return. He didn't want to force her to speak more at that moment. He thanked her, said goodbye, and promised that somehow he would tell her story to the world, but with the delicacy and respect she deserved. As he walked away, he looked back one last time and saw Margaret walking slowly toward her small apartment, a figure of humility and strength, still shrouded in mystery, but now with a much heavier weight in her story. The interview with Margaret wouldn't leave Brian's mind. He knew he had a powerful story in his hands, but he also carried the responsibility of presenting it with the depth and respect it deserved. Upon returning to his small apartment, he began to write, his hands barely able to keep up with the torrent of thoughts flowing through him. Brian described Margaret's figure from the moment she entered the hotel to the instant he found her carrying her groceries. He wrote about her serenity, the hidden pain she revealed in so few words, and the impact that the loss of her family had caused. When he finished, he felt exhausted, but knew he needed to show this to the world. As soon as the article was published, the response was immediate and intense. Brian woke up the next day with his phone exploding with messages, emails, and calls. His editor, who had initially hesitated to approve the publication, was now ecstatic. "You just unearthed one of the biggest stories of the decade. Everyone wants to talk about Margaret Thompson." But what began as an enthusiastic reaction quickly turned into an avalanche of interest that spiraled out of Brian's control. The entire media wanted a piece of the story. Reporters camped outside Margaret's building, photographers crowded, waiting for a glimpse of the woman who had captivated the nation's attention. The hotel where it all began desperately tried to stifle the scandal, but it was too late. Margaret, who had always valued discretion, now found herself in the eye of a media storm. Brian, worried about the unfolding events, tried to contact her again, but she didn't answer his calls. The feeling that something was wrong only grew within him. That same night, there was a loud, urgent knock on Brian's door. He opened it to find Margaret, wrapped in a heavy coat, her eyes filled with deep sadness, mixed with what seemed to be a plea. "I didn't ask for this," she began, her voice steady but laden with pain. "I didn't want my life to become a spectacle. The pain I carry is mine, and the choices I made were to protect what's left of me. And now, all of this has been exposed to the world." Brian felt a lump in his throat. "I just wanted people to understand who you really are and what you've done. You deserve recognition, Margaret." "But not like this," she replied, with a calmness that carried the weight of years of resignation. "I can't control what people think, but I can choose how I live. And living under the public eye isn't part of that." Brian tried to justify himself, to explain that his intentions were never to harm her, but the words felt empty in the face of Margaret's pain. She remained silent for a time, looking out the window as if searching for an answer in the world outside. "I need to go," she finally said. "I need to find a new place where I can continue my work in peace. No cameras, no judgments." Brian wanted to offer help, to do something to make amends, but he knew that the most he could do was respect Margaret's wishes. He nodded, feeling powerless as he watched her walk out the door. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. The hotel took a severe hit to its reputation, and the employees involved in the incident were fired. Social media buzzed with Margaret's story, turning her into a symbol of resistance against materialism and prejudice. But for Brian, all of this had a bitter taste. He had achieved what many journalists dream of, a story that could change the world, but at the cost of invading the privacy of a woman who just wanted to live in peace. One morning, Brian received a letter. The handwriting was elegant and precise, and he immediately knew who it was from. Upon opening it, he found a simple note. "Brian, I hold no grudges. I understand your intentions, but now I need to follow my path. If my story inspires others to look beyond appearances, then something good can come from this. But remember, sometimes the true value lies in what we choose not to tell. Take care, Margaret." The message was a mix of farewell and forgiveness, but for Brian, it also carried a heavy weight. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but he was determined to honor Margaret's words. From that moment on, he promised himself that he would use his voice and work to tell the stories that truly mattered, always respecting the choices and privacy of those who trusted him. Margaret, in turn, vanished from the headlines as quickly as she had appeared. But her story and the legacy of her quiet actions would continue to resonate for a long time. Brian dedicated himself to his work with a new perspective. Margaret's story had touched something deep within him, and he knew he would never look at journalism the same way again. The articles he wrote were now more thoughtful, focused on revealing the truths that mattered, without ever sacrificing the dignity of the people involved. Meanwhile, the consequences of the revelation about Margaret continued to unfold. The hotel where it all began found itself at the center of a storm of criticism. The management tried everything to salvage the establishment's reputation, from firing the employees involved to investing in advertising campaigns that touted its supposed inclusivity and hospitality. But the damage was done. Loyal customers began to avoid the place, and bookings plummeted. The name Margaret Thompson became a symbol of silent resistance and dignity in the face of prejudice. Her actions, previously unknown to the public, began to inspire a wave of reflection on the value of empathy and true generosity. Donations to social causes increased, and people started questioning their own prejudices and behaviors. However, for Margaret, what mattered most were not the immediate results, but what each individual would do from then on, away from the spotlight. It was then that Brian received an unexpected invitation. A charity event was being organized by an influential figure he greatly respected, and he was called not only to cover the event, but to be one of the speakers. The goal was to discuss the impact that life stories could have on society, and the organizer mentioned that Margaret's story would be the central example. Brian hesitated. The idea of using Margaret's story again in some way didn't feel right to him, but something about the way the invitation was made him reconsider. Perhaps this was an opportunity to truly honor Margaret's memory without exposing her once more to the public. On the day of the event, Brian took the stage in front of an attentive audience. He began his talk with a personal reflection on the power of stories and how, often, what is left unsaid is just as important as what is revealed. He described the experience of meeting Margaret without going into details that would compromise her privacy, and how that encounter changed his view of what it really means to tell a story. "The story of Margaret Thompson is not about what she lost," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about what she chose to do with what remained. She could have surrendered to despair, to resentment, but she chose to transform her pain into something that could help others, even if no one knew her name. Margaret teaches us that the true value of a person is not found in what they have, but in what they are capable of doing for others, even without recognition." Brian's words resonated in the room. He did not mention the name of the hotel, did not speak of the scandals, nor the immediate consequences. He focused on what Margaret represented, on the legacy of her actions, and on the deliberate choice to live a life without luxuries, but rich in meaning. At the end of his speech, the silence in the room was profound. There was no need for loud applause or exaggerated praises. The impact was in the thoughtful faces and teary eyes of everyone present. Later, as he left the event, Brian felt a sense of peace. For the first time since it all began, he felt that, in some way, he had honored Margaret the right way. That same night, upon arriving home, he found another letter. The handwriting was the same, elegant and precise. He opened it carefully, his heart racing. "Brian, I heard you spoke about me today, not to expose me, but to show what truly matters. So, I want you to know that you are forgiven. Life goes on, and so do I. What is true does not need applause. It remains. Take care. Margaret." The simplicity of the message touched him deeply. He knew he would probably never see Margaret again, but he was grateful to have had the chance to know her, to learn from her. And he knew, more than ever, that her true legacy was not in the headlines or scandals, but in the way she had chosen to live her life, a life that would continue to inspire, silently, those willing to look beyond appearances. And, in a way, that was the most powerful lesson of all. After the event, Brian began to notice something different in his professional life. The story of Margaret, even treated with the utmost respect, had left a profound mark not only on him, but on everyone who had known her through his words. Brian had become a reference for other journalists, seeking a balance between truth and respect for privacy. He began to receive invitations to speak at universities, write articles for respected publications, and even participate in discussions about ethics in journalism. All of this, however, seemed small compared to the true impact that Margaret's story had caused in society. As Brian navigated this new landscape in his life, he also learned that Margaret had begun to take more concrete action in her mission to help those in need. Using the resources she still had, and the attention that, despite everything, had turned to her, Margaret decided to create a new organization dedicated to assisting those who, like her, had been marginalized by society. She used her name as a symbol of humility and resilience, but did so discreetly, avoiding any kind of spectacle. The funds for this organization came from anonymous donations, from people inspired by her story who wanted to be part of something greater. Brian, knowing this was Margaret's way of making peace with the exposure she had suffered, offered to help as a consultant, using his media reach to support the cause without putting Margaret back in the spotlight. Margaret accepted his help with gratitude, but made it clear that the organization should not be about her, but about the people she wanted to help. "I'm not interested in more recognition, Brian. What I want is for people to find hope where there was none before, to know that someone cares. Over time, the organization grew, reaching various cities and impacting thousands of lives. The main focus was to provide shelter, education, and opportunities for a fresh start for those who had been marginalized. The impact of these actions began to be felt palpably, with stories of transformed lives emerging from all sides. Brian closely followed the progress of the organization and occasionally met with Margaret, who remained the same humble and reserved woman. On one of those occasions, he found her in the small apartment she still called home, surrounded by letters and documents related to the work she had been doing. "I always knew you would do something like this," Brian said as he helped her organize the paperwork. Margaret smiled. "I guess I don't know how to live any other way. And in the end, that's what really matters, right?" Brian agreed, knowing that this journey had been as much hers as it had been his. Margaret, with her silent strength, showed that true power did not lie in wealth or fame, but in the ability to touch lives in a genuine and selfless way. "There's something else I'd like you to know," Margaret continued, her voice now softer. "This organization, this work, all of this is my way of ensuring that what happened to me is not in vain, that what I lost was not in vain." Brian watched her in silence, feeling the weight of her words. Margaret had transformed her pain into something powerful, something that would continue to live and grow far beyond her own existence. She was building a legacy that would inspire generations, a movement of empathy and action that was truly changing the world. Years passed, and Margaret's organization became a reference in social assistance, helping millions of people. True to who she was, Margaret never sought the spotlight, allowing her work to speak for itself. When the day finally came to inaugurate a large support center, built in an old abandoned building that had been revitalized, Margaret was invited to cut the inaugural ribbon. It was a simple ceremony, exactly as she preferred, but filled with meaning. Before cutting the ribbon, Margaret turned to the small crowd that had gathered, many of whom she had helped directly or indirectly. Brian was among them, with a look of deep respect and admiration. "This place," she began, her voice steady, "is not a monument to my life, but a testament to the power we all have to make a difference. No matter how small our action may be, when it is done with the heart, it can change the world." With a simple cut, the ribbon parted, and the center was officially inaugurated. There were applause and smiles, but the true celebration was in the lives that would be transformed from that moment on. Surrounded by those she had touched, Margaret felt a deep peace. She had found a purpose, transforming her pain into something greater than herself. And although she never sought glory, she had found the purest form of recognition, the knowledge that silently and steadily she had made a difference. Brian, watching the scene, knew that Margaret had fulfilled her purpose. The hotel where it all began was now a distant memory, a symbol of how prejudice and arrogance could destroy. But Margaret was the true symbol of overcoming, showing the world that true wealth lies in what one gives, not in what one has. And so Margaret Thompson continued her path, discreet yet immensely impactful, transforming lives with the same serenity with which she had faced every challenge life had imposed on her. And Brian, honored to have been part of that journey, knew he would never forget the woman who had taught him the true essence of humanity. We hope you enjoyed this narrative. Help us by leaving a like and subscribing to the channel so you won't miss more touching stories that resonate with the soul. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. We would love to know what you think. Thanks and critiques are also welcome. See you in the next emotional video. Until then,